Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead, grab your blanket, get comfortable, maybe light a candle if you're feeling medieval about it. Because tonight, we're going somewhere cold. Very cold. We're floating back nearly 1,000 years, to a world where "winter is coming" wasn't just a catchy line, it was an annual death threat. This is the story of medieval winters, the endless nights, the freezing hearths, and the quiet, stubborn humans who somehow managed to survive all of it. Not because they were particularly smart. Just because they didn't have much choice. So, let's drift back. The fire is low. The snow is falling. And the world smells faintly of wet hay, candle smoke, and hopelessness. In medieval Europe, winter wasn't a season. It was a siege. For most peasants, the ones doing all the actual work, winter meant months of cold, hunger, and damp air that clung to your lungs like guilt. If you were lucky, you had a thatched roof that only leaked a little. If you were unlucky, you had a thatched roof that leaked a lot, and probably rats in the walls, because medieval rats never took a vacation. Your main defense against the cold? Fire. And layers of itchy wool that felt like wearing a wet sheep. But here's the problem: wood was expensive. So most people didn't burn logs, they burned whatever they could find. Twigs. Dried dung. Old furniture. Sometimes the family's broken wagon if it came to that. The smoke filled the house, because chimneys weren't really a thing yet, at least not for regular folks. So instead of cozy fireplace vibes, you basically lived in a cloud of gray haze. Imagine trying to sleep in a smoke-filled hut with your entire family, 2 goats, and a chicken that never stops making noise. Sleep well. Now, food. Yes, the other problem. See, in medieval life, food was seasonal. And winter had a very strict diet plan. Whatever's left in the cellar, and maybe a rat if it volunteers. Crops didn't grow. Livestock thinned out. Bread got harder. People relied on salted meat, pickled vegetables, and porridge so thick you could patch a wall with it. Even nobles, yes, the fancy ones, had it rough. Their castles were stone refrigerators with bad insulation and drafty halls. If you were a king, you might have tapestries on the wall, fur on your cloak, and a roaring fire in every room. But even then, your soup was cold by the time it reached you. The famous French chronicler Froissart once wrote that noble ladies in winter had to warm their hands by holding small dogs beneath their sleeves. Basically, early hand warmers. But living, yapping ones. So, if you were imagining medieval life as all torchlight banquets and goblets of wine, picture it instead as a slightly damp, smoky room full of people sneezing into fur. Let's talk about plumbing, or rather, the total lack of it. Bathing was already considered suspiciously modern by medieval standards. People genuinely believed that washing too often made you sick, because water could open the pores and let diseases in. So, in winter, the general vibe was, don't bathe and hope for spring. If you were wealthy, you might get 1 warm bath a month. If you were poor, your best option was standing near a bucket of snow and hoping for moral cleansing. Oh, and toilets? Medieval castles had something called a garderobe, which was essentially a stone chute that dropped straight down the wall into open air. Yes, directly into the moat. Which froze in winter. So, yes, exactly as unpleasant as you're imagining. Meanwhile, peasants used pits, pots, or just the outdoors. Because nothing says romantic medieval night like slipping on ice outside the latrine. But here's the thing, winter wasn't just physically miserable. It was emotionally endless. Days were short. Nights were long. And there was no Netflix, no YouTube, no podcasts, unless you count your grandmother retelling the same local ghost story for the 40th time. People survived through storytelling, singing, and superstition. They'd gather around the fire, or smoke pit, and tell tales about saints, spirits, and the coming of spring. In Northern Europe, this became a tradition called Yule, where communities celebrated the turning of the sun. Yule logs were burned. Not because they looked pretty, but because a big log meant at least one night of warmth. And if the flame burned clean, it was said the household would be blessed with luck and good harvest. If it sputtered out early? Well, maybe next year. Now, here's something funny. Winter wasn't entirely bleak. For peasants, it was actually the only time of year you got to rest a bit. With no fields to plow or harvest to tend, people finally had time to repair tools, weave, carve wood, and, shockingly, sleep. So even though the season was hard, it was also strangely peaceful. Medieval monks loved winter. They described it as a time for prayer, reflection, and the silence of the cold. Some even wrote that the world felt holier when blanketed in snow, as if the chaos of life had finally been muffled. It's kind of poetic, really. You survive 6 months of mud, blood, and sweat, and then winter arrives to slow everything down. A natural pause button, covered in frost. Let's float now into the heart of winter, December. The season of survival, and feasting. Because even though people were starving, they still found excuses to throw a feast. Why? Because joy was cheaper than meat. Christmas, for example, was a huge deal in medieval Europe, but not in the cozy, present-opening way. It was 12 days of eating whatever was left before it spoiled, drinking weak ale until you forgot you were cold, and pretending poverty didn't exist for one brief, candlelit moment. In villages, this meant dancing, carols, and, occasionally, a tradition called mumming, where people wore animal masks and performed little plays. Think of it as early community theater meets mild chaos. In castles, Christmas looked like grand banquets, roasted boar, mead, pies filled with anything remotely edible. But even then, behind the feasts was fear. Winter could last months longer, and starvation was always one bad storm away. So they celebrated because they had to. Because if you stopped laughing, you'd start thinking, and that was far worse. Meanwhile, on the darker side of the season, there were winter spirits. People genuinely believed that the cold carried ghosts. That lonely souls wandered through snowstorms, knocking on windows. That you shouldn't whistle at night in December, because the wind might answer. In Scandinavia, they called it the Julenis, a little household gnome who protected farms during winter, but could turn nasty if disrespected. In Germany, it was Frau Perkte, the spirit who visited homes to check if you'd finished your chores. If you hadn't, well, let's just say she wasn't exactly handing out candy canes. These tales weren't just superstition. They gave meaning to the cold. They turned fear into folklore, something to whisper about instead of just enduring. Because when you live half the year in frost and silence, you start giving names to the wind. But of course, not all winters were created equal. Some years, they went bad. Really bad. Like in 1315, when Europe entered what historians now call the Great Famine. 3 years of brutal rain, ruined harvests, and cold that killed even cattle in their barns. People ate bark. Grass. In some chronicles, there are whispers, those whispers, of cannibalism. But we're not going there. Not tonight. We'll just say it was dietary improvisation. The famine killed millions, reshaped kingdoms, and taught everyone a hard lesson. When winter wins, humans lose. But for all that suffering, winter also gave medieval people something we've mostly forgotten: patience. They knew life moved in cycles. They didn't fight the cold, they waited it out. They built their lives around rhythms: sow, reap, rest, survive. And when spring finally came, it wasn't just a change in weather, it was resurrection. So maybe, in some strange way, they understood winter better than we do. They didn't rush it. They endured it. And in the quiet, smoky dark, they found meaning in the frost. Let's pause here. The fire's low. The snow outside our imaginary window is still falling. And the worst of winter hasn't even begun yet. Because in the next part, we'll drift deeper, into the freezing castles of kings, the bitter hunger of peasants, and the strange little customs people invented just to feel alive when everything else was frozen. So, for now, pull the blanket a little higher. Take a slow breath. And we'll continue soon.
So, here's a fun fact. Castles look majestic in snow until you actually have to live in one. Those soaring stone walls? Beautiful, yes, but they were basically medieval refrigerators. Thick, cold, and echoing, like living inside a particularly judgmental cave. You see, stone doesn't insulate, it traps the cold. So, while peasants froze in their mud huts, nobles froze in luxury. A sort of equal opportunity misery, just with better curtains. If you were a medieval noble, winter meant one thing above all: drafts. The wind had a way of sneaking in through every gap, under doors, through windows, even between floorboards. So people stuffed wool and straw into cracks, hung heavy tapestries on walls, and layered rushes, basically old grass, all over the floor to stop the chill. It helped a little, but mostly you just got used to being cold. Even the royal bedchambers were freezing. The fire in your hearth might heat a small patch of floor right in front of it, but the rest of the room? Icebox. Some people slept in fur-lined nightgowns and heavy wool caps. Others literally brought animals into the room to share body heat. There are records of kings sleeping with dogs, courtiers sleeping with servants, and occasionally everyone sleeping in one massive bed, not for romance, just for survival. Body heat was the original heating system. And then there was the fashion. Winter clothing in the Middle Ages was creative. Layers upon layers of linen, wool, and fur tied together with belts and pins. Men wore long tunics, heavy cloaks, and thick hose, basically wool leggings but without the modern dignity. Women wrapped themselves in fur mantles, headscarves, and veils that doubled as insulation. If you were rich, you flaunted fur like it was a personality trait. Fox, ermine, mink, all status symbols. Even the church got into it, debating which types of fur were appropriately holy. Spoiler, they wore them anyway. But here's the real kicker. None of it smelled great. Laundry was rare, baths were rarer, and everything was made of material that loved to hold sweat and smoke. So imagine a castle banquet. Dozens of people, multiple fires burning, roasting meat, wet wool, and no ventilation. A warm smell, yes, but not in a good way. Now, let's wander through one of those castle winters. It's December. The Great Hall is decorated for the season, pine branches, candles, maybe a roasted boar's head on a platter if they're feeling festive. Servants rush around carrying trays of ale, bread, and meat that's been salted for months. At the high table sits the lord and lady, wrapped in fur, sipping wine, pretending they're not freezing. Their breath fogs in the air. Below them, the servants and guests laugh loudly, not because they're happy, but because that's how you keep warm. You drink, sing, and tell stories, mostly to distract yourself from your numb toes. And if the Lord was generous, the poor from the nearby village might be invited in for food scraps, because charity was a great way to remind everyone who owned the fireplace. Let's talk about food for the rich, or what passed for it in winter. Most of what they ate was preserved. Salted pork, smoked fish, dried peas, beans, onions, and hard cheese. Fresh vegetables were gone, fruit was a memory, and water wasn't exactly safe to drink. So, they drank ale. Everyone did, even kids. It wasn't strong, usually 1 to 2% alcohol, but it was safer than water and kept you hydrated-ish. Wine was for nobles, of course. Though, to be fair, medieval wine was not good. It was sour, cloudy, and had to be mixed with honey or spices just to be tolerable. To make meals interesting, they relied on spice: cinnamon, pepper, cloves, ginger, all imported from faraway lands, Expensive enough that having a jar of cinnamon basically meant you were flexing your tax bracket. There's a charming recipe from a 14th century English cookbook that recommends boiling meat in almond milk and sugar. So yes, medieval nobles basically invented sweet meat smoothies. Now you might be thinking, at least they could just stay indoors all winter? Oh no, that would make too much sense. Kings and nobles still had to travel to hold court, visit estates, or go hunting because sitting still wasn't considered regal. Winter hunts were a thing. They wrapped up in layers, rode horses through snow, and chased boars through frozen forests, all while pretending it was fun. Hunting was supposed to show bravery and control, but it was mostly cold, mud, and screaming dogs. There's an account of one French duke who went hunting in January and came back with frostbite so bad that he couldn't hold a goblet for weeks. But hey, at least he got a deer out of it.